Thank you very much, ladies. All right, thank you very much. I wore the worst possible outfit for this mic situation, but I'm going to assume that Chris, can you hear me back there? Perfect, okay. So before I really launch into this, I want to make it clear from the outset that this is not a male-bashing exercise. I quite like men, actually. And as a single mother, I raised 2 daughters in a house where I did not allow male bashing, and I still don't. It's actually my hope that all of us will share some of the concerns that I want to raise today. So I'm going to begin with a story about having a drink, actually having a drink with a friend of mine in Calgary. We'll call him Rob because his name is Rob, and I am not about to protect anyone here. Rob is not a lawyer. He's an oil and gas guy. He's an exploration person. He's been working in the oil and gas industry for probably 30 years now. And we get together 2-3 times a month and just yak. So we were talking about the guidelines introduced by the Ontario Securities Commission, or the OSC. I don't know if you would have heard about these guidelines, but they're called Comply or Explain, and they were introduced by the OSC last year and came into force in January. And I explained to Rob my understanding of what the OSC guidelines were, namely that for publicly traded companies, actually I guess all reporting companies to the OSC would be required to say how many women they had on their board as a percentage, and if they had a diversity policy, to report on how that was going. That's it. That's the extent of the Comply or Explain guidelines. And so when I described these to Rob, his reaction to me was to say, oh, Michelle, you know, you just have to be more patient. This will happen eventually, but you can't rush things. Although I had a fairly ambivalent reaction to hearing the guidelines introduced in the first place, frankly, I thought maybe it wasn't something the regulator should be involved in. When Rob said that to me, I discovered that I did, in fact, have a very strong view of this issue, and he discovered that as well. Numbers do matter, and empirical targets are necessary. Gender parity is not just around the corner, and it's not just going to happen. Women are underrepresented in virtually every aspect of the legal profession, particularly in positions that actually make decisions and run things. Other professions also have issues with the advancement of women. We're not the only ones. I know this in part because I have one daughter in journalism, in sports reporting, actually, and the other in business with an engineering degree. Their stories about being women in these fields in 2015 would make you laugh and cry at the same time. Now, my research for today was admittedly not comprehensive, but I did find that in almost every decision-making or leadership or high professional role that I looked at, women were about 15 to 20% of those positions. There are exceptions, absolutely. There are outliers, pockets of geographical or temporal increases. For example, women in engineering went markedly up for a while and is now back to about 13% of that profession. Women taking computer science university degrees got as high as 37% and is now back at 18%. There are also many more outliers that are closer to 0%. So I'm going to give you some numbers today regarding women in law, government, and business. And I apologize that I didn't prepare slides for this. I really should have, because I know that following discussions on numbers without seeing slides is very difficult, but you're all smart. And I've also got a text of this speech if you want to get it from the school and review that. Absolutely, you can. So before launching into any statistics, I do want to clarify that while I'm speaking today primarily of gender diversity and gender parity, I by no means misapprehend the problems in achieving proportional representation of other equality-seeking groups, whether based on ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, race, or otherwise. In fact, it is well known that whatever challenges women face in attempting to accede to positions of power within their organizations and industries, these other equality-seeking groups have larger deficits and bigger challenges. By speaking today of gender parity, I in no way mean to say that it is or should be more of a priority than obtaining equal opportunity for other groups as well. I've focused on women for a number of reasons, including but not limited to the fact that there is simply more empirical data available on gender. So we'll start with government. In Saskatchewan, 12 of 58 of your MLAs are women. That's 20%. And 22% of your cabinet positions are held by women. Of course, I had to look at Alberta, too, where 23% of our MLAs are women and 20% of our cabinet. If we look at the federal government, 36% of the Senate is female and 21% of the members of Parliament are women, although only 17 of 69, or 2.5%, are in cabinet. And here's what I actually thought was the most interesting statistic on the federal government website. So of federal crown corporations, they all have boards, and those boards have a chair position, and they all have CEOs. So those are, of course, appointed positions, and they're in charge of money. Of 118 positions, so looking at the board chair and the CEO of all federal crown corporations, only 10 of 118, or 0.9%, are held by women. The only federal crown corporation that has both a female chair and a female CEO is the Federal Bridges Corporation. So apparently they do trust us with some important things. In American politics, the U.S. Congress is also 18% women, right in the same range. Engineering students, as I mentioned, are now again below 20% women in practice. And female engineers, in engineering school and in practice, only 13% of their profession, even though that profession has had growth that outpaces average job growth 2 to 1. Women in business has also gotten a lot of attention over the last few years, including the OSC reports and guidelines I referenced earlier. The Washington Post reported last year that women on corporate boards, public and private, varied internationally, and they provided a list, which I think is very interesting. So the highest percentage of women on corporate boards is in Norway. It's 35%. I want you to remember that because it comes up later. The next highest is Sweden at 29%, the UK at 22%, the US at 19%, and Canada is around 20%. Now, if you look at the FP 500 in Canada, that's 17%. And there's variance within those corporations, so and within sectors. The financial sector, banking, for example, is higher. Women actually represent 23% of the directors of financial and banking institutions. But in mining and resources, 9% or lower. Oil and gas is about 8%. Sheryl Sandberg, whose name I'm sure you will know, wrote an article last year for the Business Insider called Deeply Troubling Statistics for Women. And she wrote that in the US, 50% of all undergraduates are now women, and 63% of all master's graduates are women. Yet, only 16% of publicly traded companies in the US have female directors. 14% of executive officer positions in those corporations are occupied by women. And if you look at the US Fortune 500 list of companies, there are only 21 female CEOs of 500, which is another one, 0.04%. Now, in law schools, populations are largely gender balanced. I actually called ahead to check on this class and found out that this year is precisely 50% men and women, which is really neat. But you know what? In 1992, when I graduated, my class was the first one, I believe, to have had more women than men, 53%. And I haven't done a survey, but Michele and I went up and looked at the board of my graduating class, and this is just what I know. So this isn't, I stand to be corrected. 4 women in private practice, including myself. That's it. And I want to give a caveat here. It is not that private practice is the be-all and end-all. It's just one more measurement, right, of where we are. An important part of the fight, and I do mean the fight, has been to provide women with choices about when they work and when they don't work, and where they work and where they don't work. And we need to respect those choices. I'm not implying that choosing not to practice in any particular environment is unworthy or illegitimate choice. But My issue right now is about women who do choose to stay in the workforce and plow ahead full force and yet still do not achieve the same professional milestones as their male counterparts. So law students may be balanced, but I spoke with the chair of the CBA's Women Lawyers Forum, who had just been looking at these stats that the CBA has. And she tells me that in private practice, women still make up only 37% of the profession and only 27% of private practitioners in Canada. Now you might think, well, that's not so bad. That's, 27%, 37%. We're only 50% now. We were 50% 20 years ago. So it's not getting perceptibly better. 37% of in-house counsel are women, but only 14% of general counsel positions. That's according to the CBA's Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. Now, I don't have any stats for Canada on how women fare in private firms generally in terms of making partner. From CBA data that has been shared with us by our member firms, I can tell you this about managing partners. So these are managing partners of firms. In Canada, there are 38 what we call large law firms. These are law firms with 100 lawyers or more. In those firms, 3 of the 38 have female managing partners. That's 8%. In mid-size firms, which we define as 50 to 99 lawyers, it's almost the same. It's 7.5%. In the U.S., we have some information on partnership from the U.S. National Association on Women Lawyers, which is that women are 17% of equity partners. So again, right in that same band. Although of managing partners, of the largest 200 largest law firms in the U.S., only 4% had female managing partners. Still better than the CEO figure for sure. And I'll just mention that a lot of these large firms are moving to much more a corporate structure where they have a management board, and the managing partner really functions much more as a CEO reporting to that board, which means that we're going to need to look beyond that. We're going to need to look at the composition of these management boards within these firms. So there you go. An international, cross-industry, profession-wide, surprisingly consistent band within which women are assuming leadership positions, everything from 0.04% to 36% in the Senate. Sometimes higher than 20%, mostly lower, but we'll liberally say for today 20%. So for those of you who may be saying, well, 20% isn't so bad, I thought it might be worse, you are bad at math. Women are not 20% of the population, and we're not 20% of the profession, and we're not 20% of the qualified people for these positions. We're stuck, and it's not getting better, not appreciably. And I haven't even addressed, and I'm not going to address, but I'm mindful of the well-documented wage gap that you can layer onto that, the fact that women actually make less even when they get to that 20%. One of the reports that was distributed last year at the American Bar Association meeting, they have a commission they call the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession. And I went to one of their sessions and received the distribution of a report. And it looked at the historical and current status of women in the profession in a much more comprehensive way. And concluded, quote, after years of imperceptible progress, we have made imperceptible progress, unquote. So why does this matter? Well, I mean, first of all, I hope some of you just react adversely to that because you should. But the question of why gender parity matters is not just a legitimate question, but I think a very important one. Why is this the objective? You know, as a mother, my children grew up well knowing that any request, whether it was to sleep over at a friend's house or for a puppy, would be met with my saying, make your business case. I do believe in making the business case. That's not the only argument for diversity, but it's a strong one. The UK moved, as I mentioned, to a comply or explain regulation for their registered corporations, similar to the Osc Guidelines. You may be familiar with the extensive study that was done in the UK that precipitated the implementation of those guidelines there, which study showed that companies with more women on their boards were more profitable. Sound suspect? Well, the Harvard Business Review published an article in 2012 written by 2 men titled, Are Women Leaders Better?, showing that when 7,000 corporate leaders, more than 7,000, about 7,200, were evaluated on the same 16 core competencies. Women scored higher on 12 of the 16. A 2011 Catalyst report looked at the financial returns of companies with 3 or more women on their board compared to all male boards. And over a 4-year period, the companies with women on their boards outperformed the others by a 60% return in invested capital and an 84% return on sales. If you break the US Fortune 500 companies into bands, so the top 100, then the 200 band and the 300 band and so forth, there is a consistent correlation between fewer female directors and being closer to the bottom than the top. That's from an article by Cheryl Axelrod called Banking on Diversity, Diversity and Inclusion as Profit Drivers. Diverse groups make better decisions. They design better products and solutions. If you've had any involvement with the CBA's futures report, whether consulting or if you've read the report, you'll know that like a lot of other industries and professions, the legal profession is being called on to become truly and meaningfully innovative. There are increasing and legitimate calls for us to change the way that we practice and change the way that we deliver legal services, both to provide more predictability, involvement, and options for our sophisticated clients, and to address the vast unmet legal needs of the greater population. We're not likely to do a very good job of that if we continue to use only the same select group of brains. This is called groupthink, and basically it's the opposite of innovation. Corporate America, and by extension, corporate North America, is realizing very quickly that its shareholders are listening to this discussion. Already there are movements to increase the transparency in diversity in corporate leadership. There are even investing groups, indices, like you'll have heard of the funds that will invest only in socially responsible corporations. There are now indices that are committed to looking for diverse companies in which to put their clients' money. Groups like Catalyst, where companies join and make voluntary pledges to achieve 25% of female directors, or something that I found called the 30% Club, which originated in the UK, and obviously their empirical goal is self-explanatory. These companies and organizations are coming into Canada and they're getting a lot of support. And as for law firms, the data may be even more compelling. In 2009, 2 men surveyed, again, the highest grossing law firms in the US, the 200 highest grossing law firms in the US, and they published their data on diversity. This wasn't just gender, this was diversity generally. And they published it in an article called Good Business, a market-based economy for law firm diversity. Controlling for size, geography, and market, so pricing and all of those factors were controlled for. All things being equal, the more diverse firms were clearly more profitable in terms of net profit per partner. In fact, the top quarter of the list for diversity made $100,000 more net profit per partner than the bottom quarter. Now, money is obviously not the only reason to diversify. Although, don't let anyone tell you that money is not important. When they say that, what they mean is if you have it, it's not important. If you don't have it, it can be quite important. But there are less pecuniary and arguably more compelling reasons why we should all care about this. I was at the Canadian Corporate Council conference in Calgary last year and heard Chief Justice McLaughlin speak about women in the profession, and she put quite simply what, at some level, I think we all know. We have a need to see ourselves reflected in the institutions and the organizations that govern and affect our lives. If you've ever been the only woman in a professional setting or the only person of color in a professional setting, you know what I'm talking about. I've been the only woman in a discovery or a courtroom so many times I can't even count, and I usually don't notice anymore. And yet last year, I had to give a presentation to the board of directors of my largest client. And I was the only woman in a boardroom of 40-plus men, most of whom I didn't know, an unfamiliar environment to me. And I was acutely aware of the gender dynamics, very nervous and very cognizant of how important it was that I look 100% confident to these people. I know it would have been palpably different for me if there had been more women on that board. If you are the only woman in a courtroom, if you are the only person of color, not only, but particularly if you're not the lawyer, but the litigant, You need and deserve to see your reality and your experience reflected in the institutions that govern and determine your rights. It's a matter of confidence, of trust, and accountability. Now, why do I say that empirical targets are the way to go? Well, we're going to need more than just goodwill to achieve gender parity. As I said at the beginning, it should be obvious from the data that gender parity is not just going to happen. I read a very interesting article from the Canadian Lawyer last year. It's an article written by Stephen Lawtons called Cracking the System. It's about judicial appointments. And he says that the Canadian government tables every year an annual report on federal judicial pensions. And buried in the projections for how much those pensions are going to cost is, of course, the actuarial assumptions regarding gender. In 2010, that government report projected that federally appointed judges would reach gender parity by 2027. Last year, they revised that estimate to 2035, 20 more years from now, assuming they don't change it again. That is not acceptable progress. That's imperceptible progress. Empirical targets produce better results, better chance of success, and we all know that. We have mandatory hours of CLE. We have targets as lawyers for the hours we're going to work and the receipts we're going to bring in. I'll hazard a guess that most of you that are in school have academic goals that you have specifically set. We have goals for when we're going to retire or when we're going to pay off our student loans. And here's another example. It's January. So how many people made a resolution to lose weight this year? I don't care if I'm the only one, it's fine. We don't say, hey, you know what, I'm going to try to lose a little weight this year. We say, I am losing 10 pounds before I leave for Cuba on April 15th, right? We set specific goals. I read a magazine called Runner's World instead of running. Last month's issue had an article that talked about the fact that in a marathon, you consistently see clusters of people finishing right around each hour mark. And the most popular one, the 4-hour mark, I don't know anything about this, by the way, 30% more people finish in the minute before the 4-hour mark than in the minute after. So we are good at setting goals. And when we set them, we are good at reaching them. It works. So if everyone agrees that gender parity, truly having women represent 50% of the leadership of our institutions, companies, and law firms is a good thing, then why are we so unbelievably fearful of actually setting that as the goal? Why do we set it at 25% or 30%? Why is it not 50%? Well, I began with a brief description of the Osc Guidelines. And I told you that even I was a bit skeptical about the regulator being involved in something like that. And as you can imagine, there has been negative feedback to those guidelines. Alberta, my own province, wouldn't even sign on. So, not that that's unusual for us. Here's the kicker, I think. There are no empirical targets in those guidelines. They don't require companies to reach any particular percentage of women on their boards. There are no deadlines, and there are no consequences for failing to make progress. And still people are nervous. Now, do you remember when I read that list of international countries and who was first? And Norway was first with 35% women on their boards. Guess which was the only country on that list to have included any risk of penalty for failure to reach the target? Norway. And guess what the target was? 35%. I think there are a couple of reasons for the vehement objection to quotas. Now, this is completely my own speculation. But one is the idea that women's gains must necessarily be at the expense of men. And generally, I reject that idea. Now, we haven't talked at all today about the kind of changes that need to be made in order to facilitate more equal advancement for women. But one such change, I believe, is likely to be a more equitable division of labor in the home. I've always believed that. As men begin to more rightfully claim and value their place as parents, caregivers, homemakers, we will all benefit. Our firm has equal numbers of men and women, including partners at every level, and we have a parental leave policy. We've had in place well, quite a few years. It's been used 5 times since we put it in place, 4 times by male associates, and for the first time last year by a woman. And my firm is rightfully proud of that. My male partners have time slots that they are simply not at work, but taking their daughters to dance class or hockey practice. Women's professional success does not need to mean that men are displaced. Now, I concede that there are certain scenarios, of course, in which only one person can have a particular job. If a law firm needs to hire one person, it can't be both a man and a woman. Here's what I see happen. When you say to the person hiring, but we're working towards gender parity, and that needs to be a consideration in the hiring. How often do you hear, but we want or must have or deserve the most qualified person, or we only hire, appoint, or promote based on merit? That's the one that really gets me. Of course, the most qualified and best candidate should get the job or the promotion or the appointment. But when we continually pit merit against the call for gender parity, the not-so-subtle subtext of that is that women are not qualified, just across the board, inherently not qualified, that reaching gender parity will necessarily mean promoting, hiring, or appointing less qualified women over more qualified men. And that is nonsense. And you need to stand up when you hear it and say, that is nonsense. In my private conversations, I use a different word there. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that encouraging more women to apply for promotions and appointments isn't going to mean that we don't get some duds. We will. I've sat on a number of selection committees for various positions, appointments, and awards, and I can tell you, not every single male applicant is a star. Women should simply have the chance to be considered and, where appropriate, to be rejected in the same way. And mathematically, if you increase the number of women applying for any given position, even if some of them are not ideal candidates, you'll still end up with a better overall pool from which to choose. So, what am I asking you to do? Well, here are my suggestions. I have 3. First is to set the targets. Second is to share data. And the third is to raise confidence. I'm going to talk here for a moment about judicial appointments. As some of you know, the CBA has been pushing for some time for more gender balance in federal judicial appointments. And that is the superior courts and federal courts of this province. So here it would be the Saskatchewan Court of Queen's Bench, for example. Now, last year, the Minister of Justice got himself in a bit of a media pickle by suggesting that women were simply not applying for judicial appointments and that this explained the gender imbalance. The pickle was not so much the suggestion that women weren't applying as his theories about why they were not applying. But in any event, the CBA's response was to renew our request for more transparency around the appointment process. Candidates for federal judicial appointments, at least to the superior courts of the provinces and territories, go through provincial selection committees called JACs, Judicial Advisory Committees. And those JACs are composed of representatives of the profession, so the law societies, the CBA, as well as lay people. The federal government appoints the majority of people on every JAC. A JAC will consider, usually interview, a candidate and then recommend or not recommend his or her appointment. The final decision is reserved and always has been reserved to the Prime Minister's office. Now, we know how many federal superior court judges there are, and we know how many are women. That data is publicly available. And although it fluctuates, it was reported last year to be about 34%. However, and unfortunately, that actually doesn't represent an upward trend. The percentage of women appointed from 2006 to 2014 was 30%. In other words, less than what we ended up with somehow. And better people than me have tried to figure out that math and failed. So, but I do know this: the government made 17 new appointments in Ontario last fall, right before Christmas, actually, including a number of women. However, fewer women were appointed than the female judges that were being replaced. So of those 17 appointments, it actually was a net loss of 5 female judges. The point here is not to criticize any particular appointments or round of appointments. If If the government, any government, really believes in the value of a diversified bench which better represents Canadian society, then why not make the process more transparent so we can actually figure out what the problem is? If women are not applying, then an organization like ours would be very well positioned to encourage women who are interested and qualified to do so. If, however, sufficient numbers of women are applying, and there's many that hold that view, we can't know without the data, then we need to figure out where they're getting bottlenecked. So, for example, if they're not making it past the JACs, then perhaps we could do a better job of educating women and preparing them for that application process. Alternatively, and this is one I do believe, perhaps there should be a discussion about the composition of the JACs themselves. Women are a distinct minority on these selection committees. Last year, there were 2 JACs with not a single woman. There's been no commitment made to gender parity at the selection committee level. Now, in total, and this is again based on that article by Stephen Lawton's last year called Cracking the System. He says, as of last year, about 24% of the members of the JACs across the country were women. Those appointed by the federal government represented 17% of the people on these selection committees. Now, I want to be clear that I don't mean to suggest that this is just a political issue, or at least not a partisan political issue. We've never, at the federal level, had the kind of transparency that I'm talking about here. But we need that empirical data to solve an empirical problem. And not only would the data about female judicial applicants provide us with information about where to put our resources, just the idea of transparency has been shown to make a huge difference. Now, most provincial governments, I've been picking on the federal government, most provincial governments don't release data on the gender split of applicants for provincial judicial appointments, but BC and Ontario do. And you want to take a guess on their gender split on appointments? In Ontario, they measured this from 2006 to 2012, are the stats I have. 47% of the applicants were women, and 44% of the appointments were women. In BC, in 2012, 47% of the applicants were women, and 42% of the appointments were women. So, and I happen to know that in BC, from talking to people both in the bar associations and judges in BC, that the marked increase came when they began to publish that data. So the first thing that we can do is to be more transparent, to collect and share data that actually helps us identify and address the reasons for gender imbalance, and generally for the lack of diversity in all the same groups that we've been discussing. The other thing that we can do is close the confidence gap. There may be some ring of truth to the idea that women do not apply for appointments, promotions, and awards as often as their male counterparts do. I was at the Women Lawyers Conference. They do a national forum I think it's about every 18 months. I was at one in Montreal in 2013, and one of the panel discussions that I listened to explored this phenomenon. And I remember a comment from one of the senior corporate executives on one of the panels, and her observation, she was involved in the hiring and promotion of people within her company, and her observation was that women would not apply for professional promotions unless they could satisfy every single stated criteria for the profession, while men, regardless of how many qualifications they did not have, were much more apt to say, I am perfect for that job. They are going to love me. And I must say that really rang true to me. I myself, and many, many women I know, are so self-critical and so risk-averse that we will only attempt to climb the professional ladder one very polite rung at a time, with people holding on to it and checking at each step that we've climbed it perfectly. And if we didn't, we usually go back and try it again. In Sheryl Sandberg's article that I quoted from earlier, she also says that in a survey of over 4,000 employees at various big U.S. companies, 36% of men said they wanted to be the CEO someday, compared to 18% of the women. I'm not suggesting that everyone should want to be the CEO. I'm suggesting it shouldn't automatically be twice as many men who do. 2 female news journalists, Katty Kay and Claire Shipman, wrote an article in 2014 called The Confidence Gap, and it's fascinating. A professor that they spoke with at the Yale School of Management told the authors of an experiment she does every year with her business students, asking them at the end of the year to write down what they think they should be paid on graduating at their first job. And her female students, year after year after year, for 8 years, consistently put lower salary expectations down. In a 2010 article about women in engineering titled "Heating the Canaries in the Coal Mine," the authors Janice Kalnin and Leo Valaquette included some quotes from people that they had interviewed in the course of their research. And I want to read you one. It's from a parent. "My daughter starts off in environmental engineering this fall. I hope that she is able to be a part of a team of engineers that embraces her for engineering knowledge and that she is treated as an equal by her peers. It worries me that there are not enough female mentors available for her. Not that a male mentor is a problem, it just doesn't seem to work as well. The old boys network still does exist. I worry that the glass ceiling in many consulting firms will not be broken during her career, that her superior talent may be overlooked due to her gender, and that she will get frustrated in the male-dominated profession and move on." Now, with all due respect to an obviously loving father or mother, I want to close with a story about my own dad. When I was a little girl, maybe about 9, we were living in Regina. And my dad took me down for a guided tour of the, self-guided tour of the legislative buildings. He was very big on supplemental homeschooling, and so there were a lot of educational outings. I wasn't a huge fan of them at that time. I remember walking down the hills of down the hall of the Ledge building, and Dad showing me all of the portraits of the Canadian prime ministers. And at the end, he said to me, "There is not one woman up there, but you could be the first. You could be the prime minister. You could be the first woman prime minister." Now, obviously, that's not where I ended up. And frankly, once I couldn't be the first, I had no interest whatsoever. But I never forgot that sentiment. I always knew that my dad genuinely believed that I could do anything. So encourage the women in your life, your daughters, your spouses, your students, your lawyers, to dream bigger. Give them a safe place to articulate those dreams. I think women find it very difficult to say out loud, what is the biggest thing? What is the biggest thing that you could ever think of that you might want? Even if it's not ultimately what you do, I think that there's power in saying it. We need to stop being so afraid of falling short that we don't even express our hopes for success, however that's defined. And at a more societal or a macro level, we need to demand more transparency around the processes by which women can and should be progressing professionally. We need to create a culture in which the collection and sharing of data on diversity, including gender, is simply expected. And we need to get over the idea that setting empirical goals is scary or dangerous, or that it is antithetical to advancement on merit. As women and men, as citizens, we deserve more. We deserve a real commitment to gender parity. And I hope each of you will leave here thinking of one thing that you can do to help us get there. Thank you very much for your invitation to be here and for your time.
Thank you, Michelle, for that invitation to look at what's going on around us, and I think also perhaps what's going on inside us. We have 10 minutes to talk. I'm sure you have questions and comments, so let's do it. Observations, questions? Dion.
Thank you very much for a really thought-provoking talk. I really liked your recommendation around data transparency. But I'm just going to play devil's advocate a little bit on the empirical targets thing. So the pay equity legislation in Ontario, Quebec is sort of world renowned for being some of the most advanced legislation in the world for the sort of the requirements it sets for trying to achieve pay equity. It's really involved. Really, there's an entire institutional system set up around it. You know, years later, it still hasn't actually done all that much. And a lot of the most recent research
So two things. First of all, in terms of where this is coming from, I think there's a bit of a convergence, right? I mean, we do see regulators prepared to get involved in this, which is new. But we also see, I think, a bigger push from, I find it very interesting that companies, big companies, are sort of at the forefront of this. And in the US, it's really quite advanced. So I think, you know, there's a lot of people who say this really needs to be voluntary. You can't hit people over the head. I can hit people over the head. That's not a problem. But I appreciate that that's a view, right? That it needs to be voluntary. But I think, you know what? I don't care. I don't care whether it's a combination of those things. I don't subscribe to the theory that we can't put empirical targets in place. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Well, we might not get there, right? But we certainly know that if we don't have something, then the problem is whether those targets are set voluntarily, and I talked about a couple of the organizations that I actually want to, you know, take a look at. Organizations that are encouraging companies and getting a response to setting voluntary targets. And I mentioned briefly the idea that shareholders are also driving some of this in corporations. The electorate will drive it in terms of government positions. So it's going to come from a lot of places. But the idea that, you know, that we've got lots of examples of where empirical targets have been set and not met, I agree. But if you've got the target, then at least someone's going to say, well, why? What's going on? Like, why are we not getting, you know, because we have something that we've said we're going to use to measure this, and we're not getting there. So at least you're at the second part of the conversation, which is what's going on here. Whereas if you don't have that, my fear is that we'll just grow into the idea that 20 or 25% or 30% is okay. Well, it's not so bad, right? It'll happen eventually. So that's why I think it's worth setting the targets, even though I totally agree. I mean, there's every chance in the world we won't meet them. So I can't believe I have to do this. I haven't had time to read the book. I haven't read the book. I read this article that I quoted from. I had read, but I have not read Lean In cover to cover. I've read bits and pieces of it, and I got the Coles Notes version from my daughter, the engineer that's at business school now. That's all she reads is that kind of stuff now. So we have lots of discussions, and she kind of gave me the gist, and I think I've kind of got the gist of her theory. And I have to say, I personally don't disagree with it. And I appreciate that, yes, we're saying women, you know, it's women's problem and they need to do more. Well, it is kind of our problem. And so it's not that, and I hope I made that clear today, it's not that the discussion about this can be restricted to women. It's not that women are going to be the only ones that solve this problem. It's not that, you know, I mean, I do think we need women in more positions of power because that does affect the dynamics, but that's no excuse for men who hold those positions now not to see the value of diversity in their organizations. Absolutely. But again, I don't mean to dodge the question, but I think it's a bit of both. I do think that there's some truth to the idea that women don't go and get what they want. And I think that there's some things that we could do, men and women, to make that happen more. Sure. So I have a passing familiarity with the Justicia Project. Lori Politza, who was the treasurer of the Ontario Law Society of Upper Canada, when they did theirs, was here actually speaking at a conference that I was at years ago. And so and Lori and I have traveled together on various occasions, so we've had lots of chances to speak about it, but I haven't actually studied their results. I know that Saskatchewan, you did a fair bit of work and a fairly comprehensive review here as well, and I've read it. But in terms of the impact of that study, I really can't speak to that. I can tell you that at least the Law Society of Upper Canada, I'm not sure about where it's been adopted. Alberta's doing the same thing. The Justicia projects concentrated a lot more on, which I didn't today, on the law firm environment, and basically women, the attrition, right? So the attrition factor, that women begin and then they drop out, and that by the time you get to sort of that 5 to 8 year associate, right before they make partner, many women leave the practice and don't come back. And so the parts of the project that I was most familiar with was looking at why that was, and a lot of it had to do with an environment that doesn't lend itself easily, and frankly, it hasn't been, there's just been an unwillingness to look at mat leaves and return for mat leaves, and how you can actually make that economically viable, not just for the firm, but for the lawyer, right? I mean, lawyers want to work hard and be part of their firm and do all of those things, and so we're not talking about people who don't want to work for what they're going to get, but there's definitely been challenges, right? They looked at flex time and part-time work assignments. Those have been, frankly, I don't think very well implemented across the board, and yet you can do it. I spoke here last year and made the point, again, when you sort of crunch the numbers, part of the problem is, and I don't know how you fix this, part of the problem is that women who need to take some time off work are often at the lower rungs professionally. And so in my firm, for example, it's kind of all about the hourly rate. Once your hourly rate is really high, you can do whatever you want. You can work 500 hours a year if you want, and you're still going to make enough money to cover your overhead, and if you take home less, then you take home less, and that's your decision, right? You're cutting into your own net profit. Whereas if your hourly rate is low, then there's a certain point at which you're not going to cover your own overhead, and then that becomes, I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, I'm just saying at that point, there's more people involved in the discussion. And so that's a really long-winded way of saying I don't know exactly what has happened with the Justicia projects. They focused on something a little bit different than what I have, but I'd certainly love to know.
Well, I think it's timely that your comments are saying that you need empirical data and you need actual commitments from people to look at targets, because right now at the commitment stage for the Justicia project, they're asking firms and they're asking people to embrace an idea. And embracing an idea without some statistical goals as to where that idea gets hunched to isn't, like you say, it's not necessarily forward.
You have to make the business case, right? And I think we can. I mean, I just wouldn't shy away from that.
So we will be, we will be moving towards wrapping this up, because I know some of you have a 1 o'clock commitments, practitioners and students, but I'd like to give Chris the chance for a last question or comment before I thank Michele.
Thanks for that. On the issue of the Justicia program, I have some familiarity with it, and what struck me about it that I think has been so successful, and the reason why other jurisdictions are now taking it on, is that the law societies have initiated a program where the managing partners in the big firms agree to sign on to meet. Like we're just, let's get together and talk. And it's almost like you have to be at the table thing. Like you can't not be there. And so what I think people that have signed on have not necessarily been expecting this to be beneficial to their firms, but what's happened is
They've been shamed.
they have to agree to some transparency, sharing of some statistical data, and also they have to agree to put in place a paternity policy, because a lot of firms don't have that. And so And so personally, it's one of the programs that I've seen in all the years I've been practicing that I see promise, that this will make a difference. So I'm really excited about it coming to Saskatchewan.
That's great. And thank you very much for that. It's kind of a combination of voluntariness and shaming. So.
And that's a good note to just pause.